All right, pray on, just a little while long. Pray on, just a little while long. Pray on, just a little while long. Everything will be all right. Everything will be all right. Hold on, just a little while longer. Pray on, just a little while longer. Fight on, just a little while longer. Everything will be all right. Oh, everything will be all right. Fight on, just a little while longer. You got to fight on. Don't you give up, don't you give in. I'm here to tell you everything will be all right. You gotta hold on. Everything will be alright. Everything will. It'll be alright. Sure, it's coming in the morning. It'll be alright. It's gonna be alright. It's gonna be alright.
Well, good evening, everyone. This is Pastor Robert Johnson back with you for another edition of our We Too Sing America Black History Conversation featuring Dr. Shana Mashego. And we're about another opportunity to share with you. And she'll be on in just a second. I want to take just a moment and ask you to reach out, invite your friends to come on and watch with you. This is going to be a riveting, provocative conversation. We think that this kind of conversation is so important because there are so many people who are trying to, across our country, who are trying to dismiss or ignore or suppress African American history. And we think that that's unhealthy. We think that African American history is just as much a part of the American story as the Alamo, westward expansion, and all the other themes of American history. And so we think, we know, and we believe that the telling of sharing of African American history is important. And as believers, as followers of Jesus, as coming out of a church, a community of faith, a Christian community of faith, we believe that one way to affirm the value of people is to hear that story. And so I'm so proud of Resurrection, Church of the Resurrection, under the leadership of Senior Pastor Adam Hamilton and our adult discipleship program and our Allies for Racial Justice, for participating and leading the way and offering to provide this kind of learning opportunity for the general public. So thank you all so much for tuning in, invite some folks to come on. We're going to jump. We've got so much to cover tonight, and I want to make the most of that time. So I want to bring on my co-panelist, co-host for tonight, and then we'll bring on Dr. Shana in just a second. And I want to give you a little more information about her. We just kind of rushed into the discussion last week. Tonight, I want to do more of a formal introduction of her. So let me bring my folks on, my friends, my colleagues from Church of the Resurrection. First of all, hello, Pastor Cheryl Jefferson-Bell. Good evening. Good to see you.
Hello, Pastor Robert.
And LaDonna Williams-Hunt. Hey, LaDonna, how are you?
Hello, Pastor Robert.
And she was not with us last week. She's going to be a part of our journey this month. And we're so glad to have her on tonight. We invited her on because she is pastor of our online community. I'll bring her on. This is Ashley Morgan Kirk. Hey, Ashley, how are you?
Hey, Pastor Robert. Glad to be here.
Ashley, let's take a second. So you are the pastor. So we have Resurrection has 6 physical locations. And then we have online community. You are the pastor of our online community. Share with our listening audience how many people log into Resurrection services every weekend.
We have a lot of people, and it's very, in fact, I often will tell people, don't tell me that number, please. I'll get too, freaked out and not want to do it. But anyway, anywhere between 5,000 and 8,000 online, and then TV locally, which online for us is across the US and across the world too. And then we also have in town, we have TV. So that number is staggering. It's probably between 15,000, 17,000 locally.
That's right. Locally, which is so awesome. So, and Ashley does such a great job. So folks, she connects with our online audience, our TV audience. She is that pastor. She reaches out to them, connects with them, make sure that they get connected with Resurrection virtually. And when they're visiting in the city, she helps to get them connected to a physical location. So we're so glad to have her on tonight. As a young adult and as a pastor and as our online pastor, we're so glad to have her as a part of this conversation. And now I want to bring on, and by the way, I want to just share, some of our folks are already tuning in. Thank you guys for coming on, Paul and Chuck and Mark. Thank you guys for coming on. It's so good to have you guys with us. And now I want to bring on. Did I miss something?
Paul, you forgot Maryland.
No.
Can't forget Maryland.
Please, no. I think the folks at Resurrection are quickly beginning to realize and read that if Pastor Cheryl or Linda or Ashley or LaDonna aren't somewhere close around, he'll lose all the details. So, which is not intentional. So glad to have you all. Mark Mears, thank you, Mark, for coming on. This is going to be a great conversation. Dr. Shana Mashego holds the Bachelor of Arts degree in music and the Master of Arts degree in music and research from Texas Southern University, as well as the Doctor of Musical Arts degree in ethnomusicology and voice from the University of Arizona. During Dr. Mashego's doctoral degree journey, her interest in the lives of African Americans came into full focus. While Shana's initial research concentrations were primarily centered in ethnomusicology and voice, with the focus upon the lives and works of Black female composers, she was given an opportunity to receive extensive instruction in anthropology with an emphasis on African American culture from the research faculty of the University of Arizona Africana Studies program. She's an avid researcher. I've got to let you know this about her. She founded the Dr. Shana Mashego and the Sacred Ensemble, a Christian hymn preservation ensemble where she serves as soprano and visionary. The ensemble includes soprano and piano quintet, and together they enjoy a variety of recording opportunities, including the completion of three album recordings as part of a 7-volume hymn preservation project. Wow. And performances on a wide range of stages. Dr. Mashego is also a leading advocate for the preservation and performance practice of the Negro spiritual. It is so good to have her with us. She is currently serving as visiting professor of musicology at George Washington University. She was amazing last week, and she is back with us. Dr. Mashego, thank you for being back with us for another conversation.
Oh, it is my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for welcoming me.
Okay, so let me quickly just talk about the other folks, because I talked about Ashley, because Ashley was not with us last week, so glad to have her. Pastor Cheryl serves as pastor of community justice, but is one of our senior staff at Resurrection, so well respected, not only in the Resurrection community, but in the Great Plains Conference and throughout the United Methodist denomination, a leader, a voice, who advocates not only for justice, but for inclusion and for delicate care of the people who people our congregations. And so glad to have her a part of our conversation. I honor her so much and look up to her and just give her all respect. She's just a great person. I was going to say a great woman of God, but just a great human being.
Thank you.
And I love you so much, Cheryl. And then LaDonna, our good friend, thank you for coming on. She represents Allies for Racial Justice, ministry, a joint ministry of both Resurrection and St. James Church, St. James United Methodist Church, where Emmanuel Cleaver III currently serves as senior pastor. And these two churches have come together. We did an amazing study on Dr. King's sermons back in October, Strength to Love. And we came out of that with people asking, what's next? And so this is one attempt. This is one way. It's not the only way. It's one of the ways that we're trying to offer the next step in this process. So here we go. Let's jump into the conversation. Dr. Shana, so good to have you with us. Let's start here. Folks, we're going to spend some time with her, just asking her from her perspective, what are the most significant, important events in African American history? She's going to start us off, and we're going to focus on about 5 or 6 tonight, and we're going to go from there. So, Dr. Shana, get us started. Where do you want to start?
I'm sorry about that. I think the best way for us to begin is to go straight into the historical groundwork. And so in order for us to do that, we have to go to the continent of Africa. So the first point is all humans have an African origin. And many of you are familiar with this information already, but it is extremely imperative that we understand that all humans came from the continent of Africa. So Pastor Johnson, if you wouldn't mind showing that first slide, I just want to elaborate just a little bit on this first point, because it is the most important, especially for those of us who believe in the Christian worldview. We believe that we have derived from a God who has created us all to be image bearers. And so therefore, this is an extremely important point, and one that I wanted to make as the first point. So Pastor Johnson, if you could display slide number 1, and
Yes.
We'll go from there. But
Yes.
that first point, all humans have an African origin.
Yes. Keep talking.
Okay. Okay, no problem. No problem. The significance of this, as it relates to the African American narrative, is that we truly have to understand that the concept of race is not it's a biological construct, which has become an emotional and a mental construct. It's a way for us to create division, which is not the original plan of our Creator. And so therefore, it's very important for us to clearly understand the concepts based upon our origins as humanity, as a whole humanity, a full humanity. So that's the very first point. And then while Pastor Johnson is pulling up that slide, I'll go ahead and introduce you to the other points that I would like to get to tonight. And that is point number 2, which will be supported by our second slide, will be our racial differences are due to climate differences and diet that are directly connected to migratory patterns as we started to spread across the continent of Africa and into other parts of the world, that those kinds of changes started to occur due to those migratory patterns. The third point that we're going to cover tonight will be the idea of the existence of slavery and how slavery began as a whole. We'll also talk about the Atlantic slave trade and tie that to the Arab slave trade. And then we'll go from there into truly understanding what occurred in America related to the concept of American settler colonialism. So the very first slide explains that the evolution of modern human beings occurred in the savanna woodlands of Eastern and Southern Africa. So that would mean that all humans would have been dark-skinned humans in order to protect themselves from the direct rays of the sun. And so as we study the tracings, we understand that the first major migration out of Africa appears to have occurred about 60,000 years ago during a dry period when populations in Africa were very low. And this is when we start to spread as humans through Southern Asia, into Malaysia, and on to Australia. All right. And then after this, we would have other major migrations, both in and out of Africa, that would pull us into China and Southern Europe. And so as these kinds of changes occurred, all types of changes to our bodies started to occur. So let's go to the second slide, Pastor Robert. So once we understand that climate was the cause of these differences, it starts to make even more sense to us as we study ourselves as African Americans, as humans as a whole, right? And so the idea was, as we began to spread into cooler climates, as humans began to spread into cooler climates, then they developed paler skins in order to absorb the beneficial rays of the less direct sunlight that was indigenous to our beginnings. Okay. So as we began to absorb and try to, migrate into all of these other areas, our bodies needed to change in order to ensure that we were getting the sunlight that we needed. Okay. So therefore, when you start to think about it, racial differences between various people of the world are literally only skin deep, as Kevin Shillington explains. And this would be due to these changes, due to the movement of, these local adaptations to climate, to diet, and to environment. So therefore, all human beings belong to the same species, and that species would have its origins in Africa. So we would develop lighter skins as we move to cooler climates. Our hair would become straighter. We would not need tightly coiled hair in order to protect our brain matter from the direct sunlight. So literally, we start off as one, and we moved out and started to change into what we now consider to be other. So that's the first 2 points that I wanted to ensure that we discuss tonight in order to set a foundation.
Okay. Any feedback from, as I'm navigating, any feedback on that?
I think it's interesting, that concept, Doctor, that based upon our environment, based upon our diet, and based upon the climate, I mean, that has shaped, how we look today. And this construct that race is a construct that, we just made up. We just decided, well, because you look like this, we're going to call you that. And because you look like this, we're going to call you that. And not only give you these names, but also judge you because you're different than, what I look like. And what you're lifting up is that we really don't have ground, for judging one another. We're all from the same origin. We're all from that Mother Eve. That's just deep.
That's exactly right. And so once you, and that's why I love to start here, because once you're able to start here, it pulls apart all of the nonsense, literally, because at the end of the day, we are one humanity created by a God who is completely and overwhelmingly in love with each and every one of us. And so to understand and know, as Kevin Shillington explains, that literally these racial differences that we've created to create all types of structures, legalistic concepts, are really foolish because there's no basis for them. We're one humanity who comes in several colors with lots of different hair textures due to climate and diet. It's really absolutely remarkable.
You're talking about external factors.
Yes.
These are external factors.
Is all based upon external factors. The concept of racialized capitalism, the concept of a racial caste system, a caste system that would be built upon racial differences. It's all based upon this idea that due to the darker or lighter skin, it would determine levels of intellect. It would determine, what you could become. And it's actually really foolish thinking because it has no historical basis.
Pastor Cheryl, Pastor Ashley, you all want to do some theological reflection on how that's consistent with how we understand how God created us.
Created in the image of God.
We're all created in the image of God.
Dei.
So, yes, you're not going to be surprised that I was most drawn to that, those points that were made. But I also am just to the word ridiculous. I do, that is resonating. Foolish is resonating. We're talking about sun and food, which is very silly. And what they tell me I need in winter, like it's just, it does. I appreciate you started there. When it comes to Imago Dei, I think the thing that really has been hard for me as somebody who loves theology and loves people is that when we tend to leave people out of the Imago Dei, that is really hard. And a fullness of who we are shows us a little bit about who God is, right? Like as you were talking, we are a reflection of God. So then as we look at ourselves, we need to understand that we're a mirror of who God is. And so when you're looking at another person, there's an image of God for you, and it's a piece of the bigger picture. So it's really hard. A big sticking point for me theologically is when we're either blinded to the whole image of God, or we have a hard time claiming, which is what we're talking about.
Yes. So good. LaDonna, you want to jump in?
I am taking it all in and just weaving all of this construct in with what's in caste. And I've heard you mention that a couple of times. It's just solidifying that caste system that we can see even today within those Southern Asian countries and Australian countries where your worth is based on oftentimes your skin color, how much melanin you have.
Yes, Mark. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I will share this, Dr. Shane. I'm at a workshop or training called Fresh Expressions, which is the first national gathering of the Fresh Expressions movement in the United Methodist Church. And basically, Fresh Expressions is going outside the boundaries of normal church to learn to build Christian community in unusual places. People do tattoo church, cowboy church, just wherever people already gather, going to those people and just be in the presence of Christ there, be in the presence of God there. And one of the things I share with them this evening, as a part of a panel, is that, it is just to learn the craft of the spiritual discipline of learning to see the humanity of every person you encounter, so that you don't need to become a crusader for Blackness or a crusader for, like, it begins just by valuing the humanity of the people you see every day, and learning, like, when you go to a grocery store, when you're in a restaurant, that when you encounter someone, to remember that you're seeing someone who's made in the image of God. And no matter how different they may look from you, even if they behave differently from you, even if you know that they hold different beliefs from you, even if that they believe things that you find like just horrible, but you're still seeing their humanity and valuing their humanity, that's where the work of fresh expressions begin. But I think that's where the work of being fully human begins. So this lays an anthropological and historical grounding for that. And then Pastor Ashley and Pastor Cheryl have given us some theological reflections as well. Great stuff. Thank you. All right.
Okay, so on to the third point, which is a giant point. It's a very, very large point. And this particular point is interesting because over and over again, we keep hearing it in different iterations, right? So the third point is slavery existed in Africa before the Arab slave trade, okay? And so our third slide explains that there was a hydroelectric damming of the Nile at Aswan, Egypt. And the soil in this particular part of Ethiopia through to Nubia was very rich and fertile. And so therefore, because of this, there was a very large migration into this area of dark-skinned Africans, all right? So between 5,000 and 4,000 BCE, there were all of these permanent settlements of full-time farmers who became established in this Upper Nile region of southern Egypt. Okay, and they adapted their farming techniques. This is where they learned how to do hydroelectric damming so that they would have lots and lots of water to water their crops. They perfected the agrarian concepts of the agrarian technological concepts that would be needed in order to sustain life and grow crops in this area. So there was a very large amount, as I said before, of dark-skinned Africans who were living in this particular part of the world, okay? So because of this, trade routes began to form, all right? So trade routes developed across Nubia that would go through this particular part of Africa. And they would trade gold, ebony, ivory, and captives. They were widely traded. Now, this is when I spoke to this last week, but this is when the trade of African women began. All right. And these routes were commonly used by Arab slave traders, Arab goods traders, and would eventually spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa. All right. And eventually, this would be the precursive activity to the Atlantic slave trade. But let's back up just a little bit, because one of the things that's used over and over again to diffuse the conversation about American slavery is the idea that slavery in Africa was happening immemorial. And that is exactly correct. There's no disputing that. The history shows it very clearly. But there is a distinct difference between the style and concept of slavery that was occurring in Africa immemorial, which means we don't have a date as to when these systems began, and the kind of slavery that was enacted and practiced in America. We're going to get to that a little bit later, where I'll give you a full definition. But it was called American chattel slavery, where slaves were not seen as human. They were seen as property. They were seen as chattel, which would be the same as cattle. Okay. So the American chattel slavery system insisted that a slave would be a slave until death, and any child born of an enslaved woman would be a slave. These were not practices that were common to African tribal customs. African tribal customs, pretty much what would happen is there would be a fight between two tribes. The winning tribe would absorb the people from the losing tribe. They would absorb their land and their goods. And the tribe that lost would become servants to the tribe that won. But that winning tribe would become a part of the community of the losing tribe, would become a part of the community of the winning tribe, rather than being seen as property or barbaric or, be treated with inhumane practices. So there was a completely different concept related to the idea of American chattel slavery. But my third point, again, just to make it clear, slavery did exist in Africa before the American slave trade, with it having its precursive concepts on the inside of the Arab slave trade.
So, Dr. Shane, so I'm so glad this is a great point, because I've got to tell you, I was watching, saw something on Twitter the other day, a conversation happening, and then I didn't engage in it, but I was just kind of watched I saw the post and I saw the feedback. Basically, a person was talking about during Black History Month and the issue of slavery, and a particular person responded and said slavery was happening before America. Slavery still happens, and so that actually, but it was only here in America that we actually put a stop to slavery. Like we made a choice to end it. So that's why America is not a racist nation, has never been a racist nation. That's why America is better. And I wanted to jump in and say, but there's so much, you're leaving out so much information, because it is my understanding, but you help me, that chattel slavery, what you just referred to as chattel slavery, was pretty much, maybe not completely, but pretty much an American phenomenon. Am I correct?
You are exactly correct. Now, there were precursive concepts on the inside of the way that the Egyptians would enslave the Israelites that was very similar to the same practices as American chattel slavery. But American chattel slavery is a system in and of itself. Because where it went really far was the concept of the child of an enslaved woman would also be enslaved. That was one of the largest differences between other precursive slave systems and American chattel slavery. And also the idea that slaves were not seen as human, but seen as property. That was one of the other large differences. So therefore, what's really occurring here within the American chattel slavery system is you're completely removing the humanity from those who are being traded, which was a new concept. It was not necessarily one that had been practiced before. And so what's interesting now is that we're living in a system, right? And I'm going to talk about this again when we close, but we're living in a system, in a society where the ancestors of those who were enslaved are living in community with the ancestors of those who enslaved. So it's a tall order to try and undo the kinds of mental concepts that are grown inside of such a barbaric system. But the American chattel slavery system is kind of one of a kind in that concept.
So does that mean that the way that we're living now, is that more of how the Arab type of slavery happened?
That's a really good, I've never made that connection before. That's awesome. Yes, I would say so. So pretty much this idea, the idea of the Arab slave trade, it's kind of, I've heard it referred to in many different ways. I even really hate using the term slave in that regard, because this would be the system that would cause Black African women to be enslaved in very large numbers, to be taken into captivity in very large numbers. But they were domestic workers. They became parts of Arab societies. They were not seen as chattel. And that's where the differences are. So now, just as you've alluded to, the caste system that we have in this country, where in most cases the African American male would be seen at the bottom of the caste, right? And they would pretty much be brought into situations where they are not necessarily given all of the rights and opportunities of their white male counterparts that would be considered to be at the top of the caste system. So I could see where there's that connectedness on the inside of that kind of concept, where the Arab slave trade, while it was not necessarily consensual for the woman that was entering into that system, usually families would create these kinds of treaties between Arab families and a Black African family. And so their girls would be traded, their women would be traded within these treaties. But there was not the brutality and the demeaning concepts related to those that are indigenous to American chattel slavery. Yeah. Yeah, because so I, really, if we just stay here just for a second, what's really kind of mind-blowing is this. We created in this country, there was created a system that reiterated for decades upon decades that dark-skinned people were to be enslaved. That was the concept. Were to be enslaved. That was the space we would occupy, right? And so now in 2024, we're still working to eradicate that myth while we're living in community with the ancestors of those who enslaved and those who were enslaved.
And the whole system, that the American system was set up, assuming that those of darker skin would always be slaves. And that part hasn't changed.
That has never been fully addressed, ever. It's never been fully addressed, nor has it ever been fully recognized by our federal government or any state that's a part of this country. We as African Americans, well, as African Americans now, because we weren't even citizens until after the passing of the Civil Rights Act, right? And so therefore, not really. We were supposed to be, but there were so many caveats within the amendments that were written after the Civil War that we were not really seen fully as citizens until after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So therefore, at the end of the day, what we're doing is we are trying to undo centuries, decades of misinterpreted concepts. We're trying to fight against a construct that was built on top of capital gain. That's when it gets really complicated. Once you include money, it gets really complicated to eradicate a brutal system.
It's the same reaction as Pastor Cheryl. I just had to take a breath because, we started at food and sun, and I wrote down the word water when you were speaking just on this third point, because that's also ridiculous that we're starting in a place where it was focused around water even too that created this. It's
Yep.
It's all about the Benjamins, though.
Yes.
And it's all about that, why we were enslaved and why we were seen as less than human. And all of that just kind of snowballed into what we have today. And then we're living side by side, pretending that 400 plus years didn't happen.
And actually, I have to say, it's so much more than 400 years.
Well,
so much more, simply because when we talk about that 400-year number, we're talking about only what happened on this soil, but we
Right.
don't talk about all of the precursive history that happened to even enact the concept of the Atlantic slave trade. All of that would have been in activity well before. We're talking about an immemorium system that got into the hands of the Portuguese crown and just completely became barbaric.
So, okay. So I'm wondering, what is it about our humanity, Dr. Shana, that causes us to have even look at folks that are different than us and think, and maybe I'm talking about sin, just out and out sin. It causes us to look at another and just decide, I'm gonna make you be my servant. Or we talked about money. I mean, it sounds like there's something fundamentally happening with us as humans that we can even get to a place where we can look at someone and say, you're going to be my slave.
Power and money, both at the same time. And the word of God is so clear that the love of money is the root of all evil. And so power and money, those would be the catalysts of a system like this one, literally. And so therefore, as you are in pursuit of power and money, one of the main things you're going to try to do is find support for those concepts. You're going to try to figure out a way to justify yourself, especially because the enslavers on American soil were Christians, right? And therefore, the entire idea was they had to figure out a way to justify this practice. And so therefore, this love and this lust and this thirst after, this hunger after power and money would then pull them into a space where humanity just kind of walks out the door, because now we have to try to figure out a way to justify these brutal practices. But we also have to ensure that while we're justifying these brutal practices, we are right with God. So what are we
going deep, doctor?
What do we use? We use scripture.
Yep.
We use the teachings of Aristotle in order to reiterate this concept that some are to be served and some are those who serve. And so therefore, then we start to twist the scripture around our sick ideas to ensure that there's no disturbance of these concepts. And then we have to create this idea where these concepts would live on. So then we use our Ivy League colleges to pull forth a curriculum based upon Aristotle's racist practices that would pull us into a space where now the white male is continuously positioned at the top of the caste as the enslaver.
I'm sure you've seen that statue at Tuskegee, the veil.
Yes.
You want to speak on that?
Well, I just think, oh man.
And you don't need to if you don't want to.
No. I just think that in order for us to truly understand the simplicity of such a complex system that would cause us to have to then try to figure out all different ways to express our frustration, by creating statues and pieces of art and pieces of literature, speaking about the atrocities that African Americans have experienced. There's a simplicity that lives on the inside of all of this. And that simplicity is directly connected to this concept. When the American settlers came onto this soil, they had had several failed attempts to build a nation. The only way that they could actually build a thriving, solid country was to have a free labor system. So you have the problem, and then you have the twisting of ideas in order to satisfy the problem. And that's where we are today. We're in a situation where all of these concepts related to the love and the desire and the thirst and the lust after money would then pull us into a place where we are still fighting against those ideas. And as African Americans, still clawing after just a concept of basic humanity, basic inclusion on the inside of the human race.
I wanted to jump in here and just say, I was just some of my recent study that, and you just said it, that America really, the reason they really even got into the slave trade and the buying and selling of human beings was for free slave labor, was because it was a matter of how do we keep up with the rest of the world. So the Portuguese were doing it. It was happening in Britain. The British were doing it. So in order to even get into the game, that they felt it necessary to start to engage in the slave trade. And so, which says in itself that they knew that they could not build a kind of wealth and build a kind of power as a nation without free slave labor. So it's so interesting, colleagues and friends, it's so interesting that now that there's this attempt to erase the significance of slavery in the building of this nation's coming, where it wasn't that many and it wasn't that long, and Black people own slaves too, and all the reasons, excuses they give, without any validation given to the fact that you could not have become the most powerful, the wealthiest nation in the world without free slave labor. I was Ubering while I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was Ubering, and one guy, a guy was one of my Uber drivers, just for some reason started talking about this, and he talked about how that it bothers him when people try to minimize the impact of slavery, and he said, like, just give me 2 years of free slave labor, and I promise you, I'll be wealthy in 2 years. Let me start a business, and let me have 2 years where people have to work for me without me having to pay them, free labor. And he says, and I will be wealthy. Give me 2 years. And he's spot on. I mean, I think that we have to think about it. So I think you're right, that it has everything to do with power and money. Who's going to have the power, and how do we build wealth?
So you're bringing to mind, and we'll let Dr. continue on, but thinking about issues that we're having with not wanting to raise minimum salaries, not wanting to provide insurance, and like in Kansas, we're having issues with not wanting to have Medicare, for folks, for the gap. We have a gap, and for some reason, our legislators are not willing to, take advantage of providing for, those that don't have that insurance coverage. So all these things that are dealing with money is really boiling down to the power and money thing. I'm not doing very well keeping my cool, Doctor.
You're doing great, because the realizations, it's such a simplistic problem.
Yeah.
But it has such a simplistic foundation. It's money and power. And then from there, now look at where we are. So Pastor Johnson, if we can go to slide 4, I just want to reiterate what Pastor Bell is describing here. So my 4th point is the Atlantic slave trade began with the capture of sub-Saharan African trade routes by the Portuguese. So in 1415, and this is a great number, a great date for us to keep in mind. 1415, we think about 400 years, and this is 1415. Okay. Prince Henry and his brothers, they convinced their dad, who was the king of Portugal, to capture the principal Muslim trading depot in the Western Mediterranean, right on the northwestern tip of Morocco. So by this point, now we're seeing the Arab slave trade has really, really expanded. But still, we're not talking about chattel slavery yet, right? We're still talking about this idea of consensual trade. We're pushing it a bit by the time we get to 1415. But still, that was the basis of the North African or Arab slave trade. All right. But the Portuguese get involved and they realize that there's this amazing, trade system, gold and spices and ivory and Black women, African women. And so they wanted to get rid of this Islamic middleman that was in the middle of all of this and overthrow them so that they could find the source of gold and Black female captives. I need to go back in and change the slide to make it clearer, because Black men during this time were not a commodity for trade, simply because they wanted domestic workers. They wanted women in their harems. They wanted women to take care of their children. So that was the goal of capturing and enslaving the African woman, the dark-skinned African woman. Let me be clear. Okay. And so after a victorious battle, the Portuguese would take over these trade routes and figure out their way down into the then vulnerable Mali Empire, go in, overthrow that government system, and then they would start creating these kinds of vicious, horrific relationships with African tribal leaders, first creating consensual agreements between them to bring African men now and a few African women at this time over into the New World. First, they would go to Portugal, but then out into the New World. And so once this trade began, that's when the transatlantic slave trade would start. All right. So America prides itself, and I alluded to this last week. America prides itself because by the time the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade system ended, there were right at 12.5 slaves, enslaved people that would be pulled from the African continent into the New World. But of that 12.5 million, only about 388,000 would come into what would become America. All right. So America says many, many times over and over again, hey, we only took 388,000, right? But as I said last week, by the time we get to 1840, that number would grow from 388,000 to 4 million slaves on American soil. 4 million enslaved people on this soil. There were incentives for population growth. There were incentives given to enslaved Black men to destroy their concepts related to community and family, those practices that would be a part of their African heritage. They were incentivized to fertilize as many African women as possible so that there would be more slaves. And so therefore, the breakdown of the African community system would be a part of this. We would lose our languages, our religious practices. All of those things would completely be destroyed. But most effectively, out of the whole system what would be destroyed, what's most tragic that would be destroyed, would be the community and concepts of family that would live on the inside of this system, that would pull us into a space where we would move and grow from 388,000 to 4 million. It's really, the numbers are really daunting.
And Dr. Shana, is it not also true when we say 380,000 that came to the shore and as slaves? That does not take into account. And ladies, we may have to, when we're not talking, you may have to mute because I'm hearing echo. And so when you're not talking, if you'll just mute, and I think, yeah, there we go. That according to their records, according to the records of the slave traders, millions, it is said, I've heard as many as 3 million died in the Middle Passage.
Oh, most definitely. Because this is what we have to understand.
Explain what the Middle Passage is too, because
the Middle Passage was the path. It was the path from the continent into the New World. It was that path. What we have to understand is that once you decide that this is a good, this is not a person, they're no longer human, they're chattel. Once you make that decision that they are inhumane, well, then that they're not human, well, then you would treat them inhumanely. And so just the concept of pulling them from their continent, from their space, from their communities, all the way across oceans to come onto what would become American soil was brutal. I mean, and brutal is not, it was non-humane, it was inhumane, it was barbaric. And so therefore, because there was the use of scripture and the use of Aristotle and other philosophers' teaching to situate the white male at the top of the caste, and this African slave wouldn't even have a space on the caste, they would be seen as a good. So therefore, why would you treat them humanely? So most definitely, millions would die. It would just within the transport practices. You're
well,
right.
yeah, and if you and folks, any of you all can go and read this and research this. Just read about the Middle Passage and about how they were treated on the slave ships. They were chained where they couldn't move, packed like sardines into the bottom of the ships. They were made to lay in their own vomit, their own urine, and their own waste. They would get sick, and if they got sick, then they were just thrown overboard. And so there were millions thrown overboard. And so that whole process, most of them never even made it to the New World because of the conditions on the slave trade ships in the migration from Africa to the new continent. So yeah.
What were those years again from the 388,000 to 4 million?
Sure. So 1619, if we're thinking American chattel slavery, that would be from between the years of 1619 to when the 1840 census was taken. So between that time, there were 388,000. The record shows 388,000 that would be removed from Africa during this time. But then the population density that was found on American soil would be 4 million by 1860. Over 4 million by then.
Does that include the children born from the Black women being raped?
Yes. Well, that's a good point, because, and that's another discussion. But in many cases, the children who would be products of rape between the slave master and the enslaved woman would then become a part of a different population. And it's really, really, really daunting. It gets really sick when you start to really think about the implications of that and what types of lives those children would then live.
And with the growth of cotton as a cash cow for America, which is basically in the South. So most of the slaves are in southern states. But at one point, when cotton is king, as they say, I've heard that phrase growing up, when cotton was king. When cotton was king in the South, and it was the primary source of wealth, Natchez, Mississippi had more millionaires than New York. That is a historical fact. That's how much wealth was in Natchez, Mississippi. And why was that? That is because Natchez was one of the primary places through which and in which or at which cotton was being mass produced and provided and sold to the world.
I'm seeing a question from Mark Mears, and he explains, you mentioned the Portuguese. So what about the involvement and impact of the Dutch with regard to slavery? So I mentioned the Portuguese because we're talking about the actual inception of slavery and the creation, the overthrowing of the Arab slave trade system that would then turn into the Atlantic slave trade. But Mark, you're exactly right. Pretty much every European group had some level of involvement in enslaving. Now, it just so happened that as far as America went, primarily that involvement would be pretty much focused in on the Portuguese trading system. But we talk about the Dutch, South African apartheid was created by the Dutch. But that does not mean that they did not also have involvement in the Atlantic slave trade system that would affect America as well. So this was a European concept. It was not only, just as you're explaining, it was not only specific to the Portuguese, but it just so happens for our conversations, we focus there because that's where the origin of the Atlantic slave trade system would begin.
I'm thinking about your background, Dr. Mashego, in anthropology. And I think the stickiest question that stuck with me for years, and I think I'll have it for many more years beyond this, is what is so hard about this for us to look at together? And I know that that's a shift, but I know that is a question for me at the center of it. What is so hard about talking about sun and food and water, and how we all know that it is not okay to dehumanize anyone and connect back to God's image, right? That's where in the world have we come from, having come from one, both theologically and in the world of anthropology. I'm not sure that was a question.
That's a great question. It's such a great question and a great point. And so it points back to the simplicity of the problem. Now, what happens though is we get caught up in all of the symptoms, and especially as African Americans, it's so frustrating to live in a caste system where you are so negatively affected on a regular basis. So the frustration becomes the focus and the concentration. And then because many white people who have the power to have these conversations, because they live in silos in most cases, they don't understand the propensity of the problem. So therefore, the separation, the way that we live in society is what's continuing to feed the problem. But now also I have to say this. So caste systems are created by reiterating concepts. So that means if I continuously tell you, the word of God says that our words have power, right? There's power in the tongue, right? And so that means if I continuously tell you that you are an enslaver, you are to be served, you live at the top of the caste. And then I tell the other, you are a slave. You are to be enslaved. You do not have the ability to think or act on your own at a high level of intelligence. And if I continuously repeat those concepts generation after generation after generation, it's going to be very difficult for someone to be able to pierce through that context. And that's where I feel we are in this nation right now. We're fighting so hard to try and pierce through the concepts that have been reiterated and reiterated now for centuries, right? And so we're in this place where now we're having the difficult conversations, but because of the silos, as D'Angelo explains, these silos that we live in, it's very difficult for us to hear the experiences of those of us who are frustrated.
And Dr. Shana, I think also, though, it is very difficult, very hard to see. And a point of privilege can be, you could tap out at any time before your awareness is heightened enough to make a meaningful change. You can tap out of the conversation.
Amen. You surely can. That is, yes. When it gets uncomfortable, and I've heard on either side. I mean, when it starts to get uncomfortable, because for so many Black people, we just want to live our lives. We don't want to be bothered with these concepts, not understanding that whether you want to be bothered or not, this is the world you live in. We live in a society that pulls us on to the bottom of the caste. I mean, we're still hearing about firsts, the first African American to do this or the first African American to do that. And it's 2024. So this narrative, this concept is not going away on its own. We have to continue to have the conversations. But this is the thing too. We have to have the conversations from a platform of information. If we don't understand climate, diet, and water, if we don't understand, if we don't have those kinds of foundational conversations, we'll never be able to solve these issues.
Thus, we have folks that don't believe in climate change. Thus, we have these movements happening of not wanting to teach the full history in our schools.
Amen. Thank you, Mark. I want to meet Mark.
Mark, yeah.
Mark, wow, you're awesome.
Yeah, he's part of our Allies for Racial Justice, one of our incoming co-leaders.
Wow, that's really, really cool. Really cool. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. And I have to recognize I have two sisters who are here listening tonight. My sister, who's also PhD, Dr. Angela Thomas, is here. And my sister, who's a nationally recognized triathlete, Lisa Thomas, is also here. So thank you for coming on with us tonight. I would love to get to slide number 5. Which speaks directly to what we are all trying to make sense out of. Okay, and that is the concept. This is slide number 5, American settler colonialism. All right, and so it sounds like this giant concept. Really, it's very simple. So, and this is what Mark was alluding to earlier as well. Settler colonialism is a kind of colonialism, and colonialism means I go into your space and I become king, pretty much, right? You don't matter. I'm most important. I'm going to run everything. And then you have to adhere to the new laws and the new principles that I'm going to enact. All right. So it functions through the replacement of an indigenous population, right? So those who are living in that space become replaced by an invasive settler society. Okay. So these new folks come in and they take over, they become an invasive society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty over that indigenous population. That is exactly what happened in the US, right? So we had indigenous Americans living on the land, loving the land, caring for the land. And then we had Europeans who came in and completely invaded their societies. All right. And these kind of settler states include Canada, the United States, Australia, and South Africa. Settler colonial theory has been important to understanding conflicts in places like Israel and Kenya and Argentina, and in tracing the colonial legacies of empires that engaged in the widespread foundation of settlement colonies. Over the course of 3 centuries, and I'm going to read it directly because I don't want to get it wrong. It's so good. Over the course of 3 centuries, American settlers helped to create the richest, most powerful nation in human history, even as they killed and displaced millions. They accomplished this by the use of free African slave labor and the creation of the American caste system. And this is from a book called American Settler Colonialism and History, and it's by Hickson. It's absolutely fantastic information. So American settler colonialism sounds like a giant term, but it's actually very simple. It just means that somehow a particular group of people is able to wield enough power over another group of people so that they're able to wipe them out, wipe out their ways of thinking, wipe out their ways of living, and then pull themselves into a space of authority over that indigenous population. And so that, like I said, that's what happened here in America. But then the further iteration of that colonialism, of the settlers coming in and building pretty much what could be seen in a lot of cases as a sovereign nation, right? They built this idea, they built this concept on the back of the African slave. And then once slavery was abolished, they used the American caste system to continue to reiterate this idea, this concept of power.
All on the foundation of stealing the land from indigenous people that were here.
Yep. That's exactly right.
When you shared with us that America sometimes says, you know, we only took 388,000, it's like, well, we didn't, why are you looking at us? We didn't do it that bad. No, like it just reminds me of like being a kid and getting in trouble and being like, yeah, but they did that too. No, I still did it. Like, yeah.
So once you start to really unpack just the basic, what we've done tonight is just gone over 5 basic foundational pieces of information that aid us in understanding how we got to this problem. Without a focus so much tonight on the symptoms of the problem, what we're doing, what I feel is most useful in these conversations is to understand how the problem was created and what was the basis, what was the motivation of the problem being created. And so what we've been able to figure out is this came from a desire for power and for money. We're going to go into more detail about that next week. But then from there, then now there's this need to justify the actions of the settlers. Now we've come to understand the foolishness of the idea of race and how it's now become this giant concept, that creates all of this division and oppression. But now we understand the simplicity of the foundation of it all. And I feel like now that we have that foundation, we can move forward well.
Are you hopeful?
Outstanding.
Are you hopeful, Dr. Shana?
I am hopeful, especially I have a 15-year-old daughter. She'll be 15 tomorrow, as a matter of fact. And the conversations that she's having with her friends right now are just mind-blowing, because they see the foolishness, even without all of the cultural context. I mean, she's my kid, so of course she understands all of this. But even without having a full understanding of the anthropology related to the caste system, they just see it as complete foolishness. So yes, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because of these conversations that I'm hearing.
Good.
Yes, Mark, I agree.
But the kind of thing what you've shown us tonight and what we've dug into tonight, this is part of the reason though why I think that there's just an attempt to suppress this history and this information.
Yes.
I think that the coming generations, I think people's kids, when they discover this stuff, they're upset with their church. They're upset with their parents and their family. Like, so you mean to tell me my Black friend who lives on the other side of town, and you know what I've been told is that their conditions are so horrible because they're lazy or they're not industrious or because they've just always been that way, that's not true, and that there's this long history that even precedes the founding of this country, where this system of suppression of people on the basis of race, that this goes way back, and that's how and they want to do something about it. So how do you stop that? How do you stop them from gaining that information and then wanting to fix it? Is that you say, okay, we're just not going to teach it anymore. We're just not going to teach this stuff anymore, because what it does is that our kids are soft. They're not like us. They're soft, right? The capacity to value the humanity of other people and to be upset when other people are mistreated make you're soft. They're soft. They can't handle this. So let's stop teaching it. We're not going to teach that stuff anymore, so that because we're not giving up our power. It's back to power and money. We're not giving up our power. We're not giving up our wealth. And so to maintain that system, then you have to suppress the history. But that's why it's so important that we share this history.
Most definitely. And to share the history continues the conversation, which then pulls us into a space where we can start to create real solutions. So it's absolutely fantastic. I'm loving Mark. I want to meet Mark. Like, we need to have coffee, Mark.
What I will tell you is that one of the reasons I love Resurrection is that Resurrection is full of people who are doing the hard work of learning. No church is perfect. No people are perfect. No person is perfect. But this is a church where I am so grateful that people do the hard work of leaning into the tough subjects, even when they're uncomfortable, even when we're uncomfortable, when it's hard work, leaning into those conversations and trying to figure out how do we make the world better. And so Mark is I think Mark is a reflection of the heart of Church of the Resurrection. Absolutely. Panelists, any final questions or observations before we close tonight?
Just wow. My head's going to be spinning.
I'm with you, Pastor Shirley. I'm like, how am I going to sleep tonight with all of this information? And you said your daughter, you're hopeful because of your daughter and what you hear. And I always had hoped that we would be further here, and that the need to have these such basic conversations, because like you said, it's so simple. It's about power and money, and we created race, and everything else is about how do we lay our Christian heads at night? How do we justify it so we could be Christian and go to heaven?
I think about two things. I brought a quote that has stuck with me in the last couple of weeks that was shared on social media, and it's a quote from Maya Angelou. I don't know when it was said, but it says, "Won't it be wonderful when Black history and Native American history and Jewish history and all of U.S. history is taught from one book, just U.S. history?" And it felt right that this is, so that felt right. I know somewhere in me this feels right, you know? And so I captured it and saved it, and it's sat with me. And the fact that we're talking and starting with history is, I just appreciate that we do get stuck in the symptoms like you're talking about, and not talking about the sickness like you're talking about as well. But I guess for me as a pastor, what happens is my desire is that no human being that is created by God, which is every human being, would ever walk around with the narrative every single day and being reminded of the narrative every single day that you are here and others are here, and you are always going to be this. And it's just as you describe that, it is every day, and it probably is also every hour. And it's very emotionally exhausting, I would imagine, empathetically, to have to be given that message over and over again every single day. And it's so, yep, that's where I am. And it's not God's message.
It's not
at all. Not at all. So I would love it if we could close up our discussion, Pastor Robert, with the 6th slide, because it's going to aid us in being able to move forward into the next conversation that we're going to have. And this is a slide that just shows several definitions. And I feel it's extremely important for us to have these definitions so that we have clarity as to what our conversation should include moving forward. And so the first definition is directly connected to American chattel slavery. It was an American slavery system that was originally legalized by the state of Virginia in 1662. And it legally rendered an African captive as the personal property, which was the term, that's what the term chattel meant. They were the personal property of his or her owner. And this system also ensured that all children born of enslaved women were human chattel as well, which is why the slave system is so interestingly unique. It's those two elements. It's the idea that the human was considered property, and the other side, that they could not outlive the slavery concept. In other words, all of the children born of a woman who was enslaved would also be considered chattel or property. The second definition is related to the American caste system, which is a system of racialized hierarchy that holds the white American, namely the white American male, at the very top of the system, and the Black American male at the very bottom. And this system finds its origins in the teachings of Aristotle, which were fully embraced by the early Puritan settlers who would establish America. We're going to talk more about that next week, just so that we can unpack what were Aristotle's theories. And I thought he was really awesome, until I found out that he was completely racist. Okay. And so then, as for our purposes, we'll be using the term African American in this way. In the American vernacular, the African American is categorized as the Black American who holds ancestry from the sub-Saharan African captives of the Atlantic slave trade. So now that our nation has grown into so many divisions, My daughter, for example, is considered African American, but her dad is South African. My husband is considered African American, but he has South African heritage. So therefore, for our purposes, we'll be using African American to categorize the Black American who has enslaved ancestral history. All right. And then we also, I just want to reiterate these two definitions again. The Arab slave trade was referred to also as the East African slave trade. This was an ancient immemorial system of gold and slave trading, which began with the exploitation and capture of East African Somali women and men, very few men. They were used as warriors in wars, but it was mostly all concentrated and focused on African women. The trade routes would eventually become the precursive routes to the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade's definition would be that it was a system of trade that began with the capture of 240 African captives transported to Lagos, Portugal on August 6th of 1444. So I know that we like to, within African American communities, we use the date of 1619. Simply because that is, the American system's date, whatever. But really the date that I like to hold on to, that I pray about, is the date of 1444, because that is actually when this barbaric slave trade system with the use of the Middle Passage would begin.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. This is going to be an amazing journey. This has been a great night. You all have been phenomenal, and just both Dr. Shana and what you've shared, and then the feedback from our panelists. And this just sets us up for another great conversation next week, when we pick up with what happens when the slaves land on North America, on the new continent soil, the soil of the new continent, and that whole endeavor begins. This has been, thank you, all of you listened in tonight. Please be sure to share this information. This will be Resurrection's technology team will take this video and do some editing, and we'll share some of this. You'll find some of these videos posted on our YouTube channel, Resurrection YouTube channel and Facebook page in the coming weeks. You can also go back to my page and share this video with your family and your friends, and I hope that you will do that. Dr. Shana, this has been another amazing night. Thank you so much, and we look forward to next Thursday. By the way, folks, the video you watched at the beginning was the amazing Isaac Cates. We've got to try to pull Isaac in at some point and have some dialogue with Dr. Shana and Isaac Cates. They're both amazing professional musicians, artists, and it'll be fun to watch them have some dialogue and talk about the history and legacy and journey of African American music. Thank you guys so much. My closing thought for tonight is that I think, you can't change the world in a night, but what we all can do is one by one, starting tonight, throughout your day tomorrow, be super intentional about valuing the humanity of every person you meet. And don't let any label, any human designation, any boundary cause you to treat another person as if they don't matter. Every human being matters. Every person is made in the image of God. And so maybe if each one of us listening tonight can engage in that practice, just among us, we can begin a movement that can spread to many others, and may not change the world in our lifetime, but we can make a dent in it. And thanks be to God for the grace to do that. Have a great night, folks, and we'll see you next Thursday.